A soft ocean breeze brushed Emily Cooper's face as she stepped off the bus in the small coastal town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts. It had been years since she had set foot in the town she grew up in, and she never imagined returning for such a painful reason: her father's funeral. As she walked down the main street, she felt the weight of memories, a mixed sense of nostalgia and sadness, the same kind of pain that had haunted her since she learned of his death. Emily had never had an easy relationship with her father, but that did not lessen the grief she now carried. Back in the town where her past remained frozen in time, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face everything she had left behind. The sky was overcast, mirroring her emotional state. The town seemed unchanged, small, quiet, with the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. For many, Fairhaven was a place of calm, but for Emily, it had always been a place of uncertainty. She had left at the age of 18 to study medicine in Boston and had never returned since. Not for lack of invitation, but because she felt there was no place for her anymore. Now, as she walked those familiar streets again, she was enveloped in a fog of memories she couldn't escape. When she finally reached the house she had grown up in, her stomach twisted. The white wooden house with its large windows looked exactly as she remembered. The porch swing where she used to spend afternoons reading still swayed gently in the wind, a vestige of a childhood that felt like it had happened in another life. She stood for a moment, staring at the house before climbing the porch steps. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her father's presence was palpable here, in every detail he had loved, which now brought more pain than comfort. Before she could knock, the door creaked open. Standing there was Margaret Davis, her stepmother. Margaret was still dressed in a silk robe, her blonde hair disheveled, falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Her blue eyes showed no sign of sadness, only indifference. "Emily," she said without enthusiasm, as though Emily's presence was merely a formality. Emily felt a lump form in her throat but maintained her composure, meeting Margaret's gaze without flinching. "I was expecting someone else," Margaret continued, looking past Emily as if someone more important were about to arrive. Emily, though prepared for a cold reception, still felt the sting of those words. She stepped inside without a word, dragging her suitcase through the entryway, glancing around the living room. The house felt welcoming, but everything about it now had a bitter edge. The shared memories with her father were embedded in every corner, but the void left by his absence made the place feel dark and heavy. Margaret hovered nearby but offered no help or hint of empathy. Instead, she moved toward the kitchen, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Took you long enough to show up, didn't it?" she remarked, filling a glass of juice while staring out the window toward the garden. Emily didn't reply, feeling the weight of each second spent in that house. Margaret didn't seem to be mourning her husband. She seemed irritated by Emily's very presence, as if she were an intruder in what was now Margaret's domain. After a deep breath, Emily grabbed her suitcase and climbed the stairs to her old bedroom. When she opened the door, she was shocked by what she saw. The room was unrecognizable. What had once been her refuge, a calm space with a view of the ocean, was now cluttered with Margaret's boxes and bags, dust gathering in the corners. It was a clear sign that Emily was no longer welcome in that home. "How could you leave my room like this?" she asked, storming back downstairs to confront her stepmother. Margaret shrugged, not even bothering to look at Emily. "You're never here, so there's no need to keep it tidy," she replied coldly. "Maybe if you visited more often, that wouldn't have happened." Her response was a direct hit, and Emily felt a surge of anger bubble up inside her. "No one wanted me here anyway," she retorted, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. "You made that clear years ago." The tension between them was thick. The grievances they had buried for years were now surfacing, raw and unfiltered. Emily knew this confrontation was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to hurt so much. Her grief over her father's death, combined with Margaret's disdain, created an emotional storm that threatened to overwhelm her. In silence, she turned, determined not to show her tears to the woman who had hurt her so deeply. As she walked outside to get some air, Emily stared at the vast, gray ocean ahead. She felt lost, unsure of how she would handle the coming days. The town that had once been her home now felt foreign, and the only anchor she had in the world, her father, was gone. What she didn't know was that this return would mark not just the end of a chapter in her life, but the beginning of a new one, filled with challenges and decisions that would change her destiny forever. The day of her father's burial was marked by an eerie stillness. The usually calm town of Fairhaven seemed even quieter that morning. The small cemetery, surrounded by trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn autumnal, made the scene even more melancholy. Emily stood firm by the casket, watching the indifferent faces of the few attendees. Margaret was beside her, with the same cold look as always, as if the funeral were merely a formality to be endured. Emily felt the weight of loss, but also the growing tension between herself and her stepmother. After the ceremony, a new, painful step awaited them: the reading of the will. The family lawyer, George Phillips, was waiting for them in her father's old office, a room that seemed to breathe history and secrets. Upon entering, Emily was enveloped by the smell of aged leather from the books and the smooth touch of the polished wooden furniture. That room was an extension of her father, organized, austere, and filled with memories that, in some way, continued to haunt her. George, a thin man with graying hair and serious features, asked them to sit down. Emily watched his every move, feeling the weight of her uncertainty. As much as she wanted to believe nothing would surprise her at that moment, something unexpected was about to happen. Margaret, sitting with her legs crossed and arms firmly resting on the chair, gave Emily a look of superiority, as if waiting for a personal victory in that meeting. With a grave, calculated voice, George began to read the document. The first parts of the will went as expected. Small possessions and sentimental objects were left to close friends and some distant relatives. Emily listened with little attention, until her name was mentioned. To my daughter, Emily Cooper, I leave Fairhaven Clinic and all its associated properties, including the real estate and the administrative control of its operations. The shock was immediate. Emily blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. The clinic? Her father had left her the responsibility of running the entire operation of the town's oldest clinic, the same one he had worked at for so many years. A mix of surprise, doubt, and fear surged within her. Margaret, on the other hand, pursed her lips, visibly displeased with the revelation. Emily could feel the weight of her stepmother's glare burning into her. "This must be a mistake," Emily murmured, her voice echoing in the small room. I can't take this on. I never wanted to run the clinic. I was never involved in these matters." The words tumbled out of her mouth as if they were weighted with a reality she didn't want to face. George looked at her with a sympathetic but firm expression. "There is no mistake, Emily. Your father was clear in his instructions. He trusted you to carry on the legacy he built over the years. He believed you had the capability to honor and continue his work." Margaret, who had remained silent until then, exploded. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, standing abruptly. "Emily has no idea how to run a clinic. She hasn't even been here in years. My husband must have been out of his mind when he made this decision." Emily, still reeling from the revelation, held her ground. "That doesn't change the fact that it's now my responsibility, Margaret." The words came out with more conviction than she actually felt. Inside, she was utterly lost, unsure how she could ever handle such a huge responsibility. After a few seconds of heavy silence, Margaret huffed, adjusting her expensive coat as she marched toward the door. "We'll see how long you last in this position. It won't be long before you realize the mistake you're making." She left, leaving Emily alone with George. The lawyer, with his serious demeanor, approached her gently. "I know this is a lot to take in, Emily, but your father believed in you more than you realize. He knew you had the strength for this, even if you hadn't shown it before." Emily looked at George, fighting back tears. The figure of her father, always distant and rigid, seemed to fade among her confused memories. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. The clinic, the legacy, it all feels so distant from me now." George placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to make all the decisions right now. There's time to understand the situation and prepare yourself. But know that, above all, he wanted you to find your own path in this journey." Emily nodded, though inside she felt a whirlwind of emotions. She knew the coming days would be crucial, and the idea of returning to the clinic, a place filled with memories of her father, was something that terrified her. The clinic was more than just a building. It was the symbol of everything she had left behind, and now, it would be the battleground for her future. The cold wind blew through Fairhaven that morning, matching the turmoil in Emily's thoughts as she approached the entrance of Fairhaven Clinic. The red brick building, with its imposing facade and metal signs indicating its long history, seemed to stare back at her like a sentinel guarding her father's secrets. Emily felt like a stranger, both in that town and in the place that now belonged to her. "How can I run a clinic when I can barely handle my own life?" she thought. But something deeper pushed her forward. The weight of her father's legacy, the unanswered questions swirling in her mind, and an inexplicable drive to understand why he had placed so much faith in her. As she walked inside, the familiar scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from the small cafe in the lobby greeted her. The bright, sterile lights illuminated the space, creating an impersonal atmosphere. The few employees passing through the corridor glanced at her with curiosity, unaware of her true identity. Emily kept her head high, though anxiety gnawed at her insides. "I need answers," she muttered to herself as she walked toward the reception desk. Behind the counter, a young woman with blonde hair tied up in a ponytail and a friendly expression smiled at her. "Good morning. How can I help you?" asked the receptionist with a kindness Emily hadn't expected. Her name tag read Sarah. "I'm Emily Cooper," she said, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. I'm the new owner." The receptionist's eyes widened for a moment, clearly surprised. "Oh, of course, Miss Cooper. We've been expecting you. Dr. Ferguson mentioned your arrival." The name of the chief medical officer, Jonathan Ferguson, echoed in Emily's mind. He had worked with her father for years and, according to what she had been told, was the clinic's second in command. Emily still wasn't sure what her approach would be, but she knew she had to start understanding how things worked in that place. She gave a brief nod to Sarah and asked to be taken to Ferguson's office. While she waited at reception, Emily discreetly observed the clinic's activity. Something didn't seem right. Employees moved through the hall with tense expressions, almost too rushed for a place dedicated to healing and care. She also noticed a distant murmuring, hushed voices drifting through the walls, and something in her gut told her that much more was at play here than she had imagined. Minutes later, the double doors at the end of the hallway opened, and Jonathan Ferguson emerged. A middle-aged man with thinning gray hair, thin glasses, and a rigid posture, he walked toward her. His expression was polite but cautious, as if he were calculating every step. "Miss Cooper," he said, offering a firm though not warm handshake. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. My deepest condolences for your loss." "Thank you, Dr. Ferguson," Emily replied, trying to mask her discomfort. "I'd like to get a better understanding of how things work here at the clinic. I admit I'm still processing everything and I feel like there's a lot I need to learn." Ferguson led her to his office, a sober, orderly space lined with shelves full of files and framed diplomas on the walls. "Your father was always very dedicated to this place. We've followed his directives with the utmost respect and commitment. The clinic has thrived under his leadership, and I hope we can continue on the same path." Emily sat in the leather chair, trying to project an air of confidence. "Dr. Ferguson, I understand the clinic has a long history of success, but I need to be honest. Since I've returned to Fairhaven, I've been hearing some rumors about administrative issues and possible irregularities. That concerns me." Jonathan raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by her directness. "Rumors? What kind of rumors?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Things involving financial management, unnecessary treatments being recommended, and maybe even fund misappropriation," Emily replied, watching his reaction closely. Ferguson kept his expression controlled, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw that didn't escape her notice. "These are serious accusations, Miss Cooper," he said slowly. "I can assure you that the clinic has always operated within legal and ethical boundaries. If there has been any misunderstanding or administrative error, it will be promptly corrected." But Emily wasn't convinced. His response was evasive, and she sensed something much larger was being concealed. "I'll need to review all the clinic's financial documents and patient records from the past few years," she said firmly. Ferguson leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course, but I'd recommend familiarizing yourself with the day-to-day operations first. It may not be necessary to dig into the past before you understand how things currently run. Your father trusted me fully as well as the team." That mention of her father felt like an attempt to silence her, to appeal to the emotional bond that still tied her down. However, Emily had already made up her mind. She knew she couldn't trust anyone blindly until she understood what was really going on. "I plan to do both," she responded with determination. "I'm here to make sure my father's legacy continues the right way." Ferguson watched her for a long moment before nodding. "As you wish, Miss Cooper. We'll arrange the documents for you. But if I may say, running a clinic like this is no easy task. Many have failed trying to change what doesn't need changing." "I don't plan to fail, Dr. Ferguson," Emily said, standing up. "And I don't plan to ignore what might be wrong." As she left the office, Emily felt as though she had just stepped into a minefield of secrets and shadows. Something was deeply wrong with that clinic, and now more than ever, she knew she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The sun had barely risen over Fairhaven when Emily arrived at the clinic for her first day as an employee. She had chosen to start quietly, posing as a new administrative assistant, with no one knowing her true identity. Emily's plan was simple: to immerse herself in the clinic's daily life and closely observe what was happening behind the scenes. She needed to understand why this place, once a symbol of medical dedication and healing, now seemed shrouded in a web of dark secrets. Dressed in a simple uniform, Emily blended easily with the other staff, who barely glanced at her, unaware of her true position. The day began with trivial tasks, filing records, organizing documents, nothing that raised suspicion. However, the longer she spent in the clinic, the clearer it became that something was wrong. The hushed conversations between staff members, their tense expressions, and the rushed pace of some doctors and nurses suggested an undercurrent of unease, as if everyone knew something was amiss but no one dared speak openly about it. Later that morning, as Emily sorted through some old records in the clinic's filing system, she noticed the first discrepancy. Expensive and prolonged treatments were being repeatedly recommended to patients who, according to the files, didn't show severe symptoms. Minor ailments were being treated as emergencies, and complex procedures were scheduled without apparent necessity. At first, she thought it might be a mistake, an oversight by some employee during the filing process. But as she continued reviewing the records, she realized the pattern repeated itself over and over. This can't be a coincidence, Emily thought, her heart racing. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she recalled her father's words about always valuing ethics above all else. How could something like this be happening in a place he held so dear? She glanced around, making sure no one was watching her, and began taking notes on the anomalies she found. During her lunch break, Emily decided to investigate further. In the clinic's cafeteria, while sipping her coffee, she overheard fragments of a conversation between two employees sitting nearby. They spoke in hushed tones, but Emily caught enough to heighten her suspicions. "He wants me to approve all these tests, even though we know they aren't necessary. If I refuse again, I could lose my job," one of the nurses muttered, clearly distressed. "I know we're all in the same boat. Dr. Ferguson has his ways of pressuring us. I don't want any trouble, so I just do what he says," the other replied with a resigned look. Emily's chest tightened. Jonathan Ferguson, the man her father had trusted for so many years, now seemed involved in something much bigger and much darker. She needed more concrete evidence, but the confirmation that manipulation was taking place within the clinic was beginning to emerge. It was a dangerous game, and she knew that if her true identity were discovered, she could not only lose control of the clinic but also put herself at risk. In the days that followed, Emily delved even deeper into her investigation. She discovered a significant amount of money was being funneled into suspicious accounts, and patient records were being altered to justify more expensive treatments. Worse yet, it seemed Dr. Ferguson wasn't acting alone. He had allies within the clinic, people who were also benefiting from the scheme. Emily also started to notice the suspicious behavior of other doctors. Rodrigo Ferreira, one of the clinic's most respected surgeons, was frequently mentioned in the records showing irregularities. His reputation as an authoritative doctor concealed his involvement in unnecessary medical procedures. Every time his name came up, Emily felt the tension rise. The more she investigated, the clearer it became that Rodrigo was a key piece of the puzzle. One afternoon, as Emily was reviewing some documents in the clinic's archives, a voice startled her. "New here, right?" It was Livia, a nurse who seemed to be one of the few friendly faces in the clinic. Livia was young, but her tired eyes showed that she had seen too much during her time there. "Yes, it's my first month here," Emily replied, trying to maintain her cover. "Well, just a word of advice. Be careful who you trust around here. Not everyone plays fair. And stay away from Rodrigo," Livia said, forcing a smile before hurrying off, as though she had already said too much. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing. She knew she was close to uncovering something important, but she also knew she risked exposure. The tension inside her grew with every new detail she uncovered. She was beginning to feel the weight of not only the responsibility her father had left her, but also the deep-rooted corruption within the clinic. The sense of standing on the edge of something big, something that could explode at any moment, left her feeling anxious. By the end of that week, Emily knew she needed more time. Time to gather evidence, time to understand the alliances being formed inside the clinic, and most importantly, time to decide her next move. Everything indicated that a confrontation was inevitable, but she had to be ready. As Emily prepared to leave the clinic that night, the weight of everything she had discovered seemed to bear down on her. Walking out through the glass doors, the cold wind of Fairhaven brushed against her face, bringing with it a deep sense of loneliness. She thought of her father, his final words to her, and wondered what he would have done in her situation. His legacy was at risk, but now it was Emily who carried the burden of protecting it. The clinic, which had once symbolized only a distant connection to her father, had now become a battleground for her integrity and courage. She knew it wouldn't be easy to expose Rodrigo, Ferguson, and the others involved. She knew that standing up for the truth would require sacrifices. But she also knew that behind every tough decision, her father had believed in her, more than she had believed in herself. Emily looked up at the darkened sky, taking a deep breath, and made a decision. This wouldn't just be a fight to save the clinic. It would be a journey to rediscover her own strength and what it truly meant to carry on her father's legacy. Emily's journey is just beginning. Have you ever faced challenges that seem too big to overcome? Don't let fear and difficulties define who you are. Like Emily, dig deep and find the strength to stand up for what's right and fight for what matters most. If this story inspires you, like this chapter, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs a dose of courage. Your story could be the start of a great change.